In today's video, I'm going to go through my settings that I use on the Fujifilm XT5 for street photography. I'll walk you through the basic setup of the camera, how I have it set so that it's ready to quickly capture everything on the street. And at the end, I'm also going to give you my Fujifilm recipes, some really nice recipes for different scenarios that work really well in different lighting situations. So let's get into it. We start out with the basic setup of the camera. I usually shoot in aperture priority, so I'm going to have the ISO dial and the shutter speed dial on A for auto, and I'm going to just control my depth of field, what I want in focus and stuff with the aperture ring on the lens, which is a really nice feature as well. And so we'll go into the IQ menu, and that's the top menu on the left, and obviously I'm going to have it at the largest image size. Now, depending on whether you want to do post-production or not and editing afterwards, you can set this to RAW or JPEG. I have a fine JPEG and RAW set. And the reason for that is that most of the time I love the way that Fuji JPEGs look, but I do want the RAW as a backup. I archive those RAW files so that in the future I can edit them and process them again if I want to. I go with lossless recording on the RAW, and you can choose JPEG or HEIF. I just leave it to JPEG for now because it's more compatible with more systems. The film simulations, now, there's a couple that I have that are favorites. I particularly like when I'm shooting in the Philippines, and if I'm just shooting generally on the street, I like classic chrome. I think it just gives that nice, slightly muted documentary type look from, you know, years gone by. But I do really, really like classic neg. I love classic neg. It pulls the shadows down a little bit more. It gives you slightly more of a dramatic image. The one thing I've noticed is that it works well for Caucasian skin tones. It doesn't work well for Asian skin tones, so for darker skin tones. Those are the two that I use by far the most. And then if I'm shooting in black and white, I'll go with Acros, depending on the scene. So if I'm going out and I think mainly I'm going to be shooting candids of people, I'll do Acros with a green filter. If I'm doing more architecture type stuff, or perhaps even if I'm doing a little bit more landscape stuff, I might put a red filter on there. I leave the grain effect off. And the reason for that is that I've actually got some film recipes that add the grain effect in. So if I want that more grainy sort of analog effect on the photos, then I'll probably be using one of those film recipes. I leave color chrome effect off, and color chrome FX blue, I leave that off as well. Smooth skin effect, I definitely leave that off. Now, white balance, you can go with an auto white balance, but I quite like to have a sunlight daylight white balance, because if I'm shooting and the light's changing, I don't want the white balance to correct it, because if I've got a nice tint coming in from some sunlight, then if you have auto white balance, it's going to correct that and try and make everything look just back to white, you know, so you've got a correct white point according to the camera. I prefer to leave it in sunlight most of the time because then that will actually show the changing light rather than trying to correct it. And if I want to change that, then manually I can quickly change that if I want to. Dynamic range I leave to auto. Dynamic range priority I'm turning off. The tone curve, I will quite often, because I like quite contrasty images, I will put +2 or +3 in the shadows. That I find just pulls those shadows down, and it's the bottom bit of the S curve that you would do in post. Sharpness I leave as is. High ISO noise reduction, I always put that on -4. It doesn't matter what I'm shooting, when I'm shooting. The high ISO noise reduction, I put it on -4, and I'd really suggest that everyone does that. I don't like the noise reduction that they have in Fujifilm cameras. I find that it can mush the details, and I'd rather have more grain and more detail than mushy, soft looking photos. Color space, this depends really on what you're going to do. If you're shooting in JPEG, it's going to be sRGB anyway. That is the color space that JPEG uses. And if you're just posting online to Instagram, things like this, then sRGB is the one to go for. Back in the Philippines in my studio, I've actually got a professional Canon printer, so I shoot in Adobe RGB because then those raw files will give me all that extra color information. Focusing is pretty important, obviously, with street shooting, and what I find is that I really only use 2 focusing modes. So I will go in continuous focus for 95% of the time, and we're just going to switch that on this front dial here. So we switch between single, continuous and manual. I'm in continuous almost all the time. So most of the time I'm going to be in zone if I think that anything's moving. So if I've got people in the scene and I'm trying to just go with them and follow them into an area, or if I am waiting for people to move into a scene, then I will have a zone focus, because it just gives you a slightly bigger area where the camera's going to focus, which means it's going to pick up the person more quickly. Because I'm usually shooting at quite a deep depth of field on the APS-C sensor of 5.6 or even f8, as long as the focus gets within, you know, a couple of inches of where it needs to be, then everything's going to be sharp. I will switch to single point if I am shooting something very specific and I need the focus point to be in an exact point. I don't touch the AF continuous custom settings at all, because what I'm photographing is not really challenging the Fuji X-T5's autofocus, so I don't find that I need to mess with that. If you're a sports shooter, then obviously you might do. I always put the number of focus points on 425. I just want as many focus points as I can. Face and eye detection, I have that set to a custom button, which I'll go through my custom settings in a minute for the custom buttons. Most shots I don't necessarily want it on. I also interlock spot, AE and focus area, so that if I'm focusing on a certain point in the image, the auto exposure is going to expose for that part of the image, and therefore I'm ensuring that what I really am interested in the photo is going to be exposed properly. If some of these settings don't work for you, change them. Just try the settings that I'm saying, but if something doesn't work for you, then just switch it out and try something else and experiment, and you'll work out what feels right to you and what works with the way that you photograph, the way that you shoot. 80% of the time I'll be in multi-metering mode in the photometry setting, and that's gonna give you a good balanced overall exposure. I do switch out sometimes to spot metering, and that's if I'm out and it's very contrasty scene, and for instance I want to expose for the highlights on the bright wall of something, and I definitely want everything else to go into shadow. I'd be interested to see how you guys set up your X-T5. Maybe some of you have some really nice ways to set up that works really well for you. I'd love to hear. Pop it down in the comments down below, because maybe you can give me some tips, and some of the ways that you set up might be better than what I'm doing at the moment. We're just going to go through auto ISO settings. So I'm shooting on auto ISO most of the time. So my auto ISO settings, I have one set up for general shooting, and that's my auto ISO 1. And I have the ISO base set to 125. And I have the ISO limit set to 12,800, which is a little bit high, but I just have it there for flexibility. The camera won't go there unless it needs to because of your exposure settings. So, and I have the minimum shutter speed set to 1/160th of a second, which 1/160th is fast enough to freeze little bits of movement in people's faces if you're doing candid portraits or something like that. You could go a little bit higher. So in the Philippines, I would put that up to 1/200th or 1/250th of a second, because there's more light there. That's my standard auto ISO setting. Then I have a second one which I'll use for low light. I set that up, again, default sensitivity, ISO 125. My max sensitivity on that one, I'll go to 12,800 again. But my minimum shutter speed on that one, I'll drop down to 1/100th of a second. Just allows a little bit more light into the camera, so the camera's allowed to slow it down to 1/100th of a second instead of 1/160th. So I thought it might be helpful for you guys to see how I've set up the function buttons. This might not be perfect for you. This is just how I feel like it's working well for me, and I can memorize it, and I can also put a lot of these settings across onto the X100VI that I have, and so I'm not getting too confused between the two. So the first one we have is that top function button, function 1, just to the right of the shutter. And I've got that up for face detect. And the reason I've got that on face detect is, particularly when I was in the Philippines, I was shooting a lot of candid portraits and stuff. And so the face detect, as I say, does work pretty well. And if I feel like it's going to do a quicker job than me focusing on someone's eyes, then I'll just quickly whack the function 1 button, give it a quick press, and we can flick between face detect on and off. The next setting I've got is AF modes, and the reason I've got that is because most of the time I'm only using single point and zone, and so I can just quickly switch between those two. And so within 2 presses you can be from single point to zone without having to scroll through this wheel at the back. So it's a pretty quick way of changing your autofocus. So I map the auto ISO feature to the auto exposure lock button as well within the function button setup, and that way I have quick access to my daytime settings, but if the light's fading or should I need a slightly different setting, then I can quickly flick between the auto ISO modes that I've got. The D-pad got set up for your metering modes. So the top button, I can press it quickly and I can switch between multi-mode, which is what I use most of the time, and quickly go into spot metering mode if I see something that I want to spot meter for, such as highlights and things like that. Because I do shoot quite a bit in JPEG, or I shoot JPEG and RAW, but I quite often keep the JPEG files, I'll have the left button on the D-pad set to change my film simulations in case I just want to see, you know, get a different look. Most of the time I find that white balance I'm sticking in sunny, as I said, so I'll stick it in sunlight most of the time, but there are times when that does give a weird color, and so I will have the white balance set up on the right D-pad button. Okay, so that is pretty much how I set up my X-T5 for street photography. But now let's go into these Fujifilm recipes. So I have my Fuji recipes set up and I get them, I've got to give a shout out to Fuji X Weekly. I get them from there and then I just tweak them as I go. But the base ones are coming from Fuji X Weekly, so make sure to head on over and check their site out. You can also download an app where you can just quickly get the settings for different film profiles. Put those film profiles into your camera. If you don't know how to do that, it's pretty simple. So you go through the settings, change the settings as you want, and then you're gonna go into the menu and you're going to go to the custom settings and you're just gonna save custom settings. It's on IQ tab and it's the third tab down within the IQ tab, and you can just go edit, save custom settings. And what's great about Fuji is as well is you can name the custom settings, which is really useful. So I have a beautiful black and white Tri-X that I use, and this is taken across from Fuji X Weekly. I'll put the settings up on the screen here now, and it's also in the blog post. It's very contrasty, it's a bit like Tri-X 400, that's what they call it. One thing to note on all of these film simulations is if you add clarity, which a lot of them do, it does slow the camera down. I have another one which I particularly like, particularly on cloudy days, but it also works in normal light as well, and it gives a nice rich tones in the colors, and that is Kodak Ultramax 400 Cloudy, so I'd recommend that one. And the settings again will be on the screen here and on the blog post, so if you want to go through my blog post you can look at that. And then finally I have another one set up which I particularly like, and it's using the nostalgic neg film simulation, and that's it. So you can go ahead and go and save that one to one of your custom settings, and I find that that profile is good for almost all situations. I'd love to see some of your film recipes, what you use them for, or which ones you find the best, or if there's anywhere else that you get film recipes from that you find work really well for the camera. Anyone's got any comments or any questions, pop them down below. I'll be more than happy to answer them. Until next time, thanks for watching.